Okay, welcome. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center located in Glen Cove, New York. Welcome to our Curator's Corner. This is an online program that I've been holding weekly for the past couple of months to focus on particular objects in our collection while our building was closed. Now, our building is now open. We are open by reservation only and with limited hours to take concerns about the spread of COVID-19 into account. But please, if you're interested in coming and taking a look and a walk through our gallery and seeing some of the objects that I've talked about over the last few months, please give us a call, make a reservation, and come and visit on your own through the galleries. You can find all the information about how to make a reservation on our website at www.hmtcli.org. Okay. Let's see, what else do I need to say? First, as always, I want to encourage you to pose any questions that come up using the Q&A feature of Zoom, and I will make sure to make time to get to those at the end of my presentation. I'd also like to thank people who've made contributions to support our virtual programming and ask any of you, if you haven't, to please go to our website and click the Give Now button. Okay, today I am talking about a newspaper article from Newsday that we have in our gallery that shows or highlights the role played by Dr. Leslie Lukash in the identification of Josef Mengele's remains in the mid-1980s. At the time, Dr. Leslie Lukash was the chief medical examiner for Nassau County and one of the most highly respected forensic pathologists in the country. Born and raised in the Bronx, Lukash earned his medical degree from Tulane University in 1944 and then served in the Army. Even before entering the Army, he knew he was interested in forensic pathology. While most physicians struggle to find cures for ailing patients, Lukash saw it as his mission to find what was killing people or what killed people. He later wrote, "I was always interested in the causation of disease and death." And he wanted to be one of the people who helped establish, after someone died, what was a reasonable explanation for their cause of death. In 1952, he saw an opening for a job in the Nassau County's medical examiner's office. He applied and got the position. Within 5 years, he was running the office, a job he would then hold for the next 46 years, finally retiring in the year 2000. Over his career, it was estimated that he performed 5,000 autopsies and supervised 40,000 more. His compassion and interest never seemed to wane. At one point, he described his work saying, "This is the most challenging, most intellectual, most academic of all specialties in the practice of medicine. Each case is a jigsaw puzzle, and it's up to us to put all the pieces together." Lukash quickly gained a reputation both in Nassau County and beyond as a highly competent and compassionate doctor, also for being a guy who had the tendency to arrive at crime scenes with a large Cuban cigar hanging from his mouth. While he later gave up smoking, for a time it was his trademark look. In the early 1960s, after about a decade developing his reputation in the field, he became involved in a campaign to establish national standards for medical examiners. The result was the establishment in 1966 of the National Association of Medical Examiners. And one of the three names on the original certificate of incorporation was Leslie Lukash. Lukash would also serve as the third president of the organization. In 1984, Lukash was part of a team of forensic scientists sent to Argentina to examine exhumed bodies to help determine who were among the disappeared, the thousands of people killed by the Argentine government in the years between 1976 and 1983 in an effort to suppress opposition to military rule. This picture shows the mothers and grandmothers who started marching in the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires to campaign for the government to tell them what happened to their children, a campaign that lasted well past the fall of the military junta from power in 1983. Lukash was one of the people called on to help identify those children, a massive task that goes on even today. A year after Lukash was called to Argentina, he was contacted by the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles along with Senator Alphonse D'Amato, powerful New York senator, to help with perhaps his most famous case, helping to identify the remains of Dr. Josef Mengele. By 1985, Mengele was one, if not the most well-known Nazi war criminals to have evaded capture. Indeed, over the years between the end of the war in 1945 and the 1980s, Mengele, known by some as the Angel of Death, became one of the most familiar symbols of Nazi evil. Even right after the end of the war, in May of 1945, Mengele had been included as one of the 800 or so people included on the UN War Crimes Commission wanted list, a list that would eventually grow to over 60,000 names, included in the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, Kraukas. But it was in the years after the war that more and more survivors mentioned the significance of Mengele. Mengele, as you may know, was born in Germany in 1911. He earned a PhD in physical anthropology in 1935 from the University of Munich, and then continued his studies in medicine, passing the state exam in the summer of 1936, and completing a year of practicum at the University Institute of Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt. This is a photo that was taken of him during that period in Frankfurt. His formative education years witnessed the rise of the Nazi Party, an organization that Mengele joined in 1938. 1938 was also when Mengele joined the SS, the elite group within the Nazi Party that had originally served as Hitler's bodyguards, but by 1938 were responsible for the oversight of the German police and for the running of concentration camps. When World War II started in 1939, Mengele volunteered for the medical service in the Waffen-SS, the combat arm of the SS, serving in Ukraine and in Russia. He was wounded in 1942 and sent back to Berlin, where he worked in the headquarters of the SS's Race and Settlement Main Office, really the core of the SS headquarters. After less than a year in Berlin, however, he applied to work in the relatively newly established labor camp and killing center in Auschwitz. Mengele's responsibilities included providing medical care to the guards stationed at Auschwitz, preventing the spread of disease from prisoners to guards, and participating in the selection process shown here, where his role was to determine who was healthy enough to work and who should be sent directly to the gas chamber to be murdered. Today, it's hard to understand, I think, how Nazi doctors who had taken the Hippocratic Oath could knowingly send people to be murdered. But in Mengele's mind, he was working for the greater good of the German people, for the Volk. And this was an idea that was shared by many in the medical establishment in Germany. And Mengele was hardly alone in the medical profession to hold this view. Indeed, the Nazis' success at convincing the German population about the need to persecute the Jews was partially based on their success in co-opting German doctors and medicalizing the killing process. At Auschwitz, Mengele was one of perhaps 30 physicians working in the camp. And he was not, as some suggest, the senior physician on staff, but instead worked under the direction of Dr. Eduard Wirth, the garrison physician and chief medical authority, shown here on the right, along with another doctor at Auschwitz, Ino Lolling. But Mengele seemed to thrive at Auschwitz more than his fellow doctors. Medical historian Robert J. Lifton wrote, "More than any other SS doctor, Mengele realized himself in Auschwitz. There he came into his own, found expression for his talents, so that what had been potential became actual." Like other Nazi doctors, like other Nazi doctors in concentration camps, Mengele saw the opportunity to conduct research using the prisoners as his subject. He was particularly interested in research that could prove the supremacy of heredity over environment, and thus strengthen the Nazi premise of the genetic superiority of the Aryan race. Another research area was developing a test that would provide conclusive evidence of a person's race. For this type of hereditary research, the most useful subjects were identical twins who had the same genetic makeup. For most researchers, however, the challenge was finding enough identical twins to base a statistical study on. But Mengele realized that Auschwitz, which served as a catchment for a massive swath of Central and Southern Europe, was going to make the struggle to find twins significantly easier. More than 1 million people were brought to Auschwitz and forced to march in front of him or his colleagues. He saw it as an opportunity. Two things combined to make Mengele particularly well known in the wake of the Holocaust. First was the peculiarity of Auschwitz, which was both a killing center and a labor camp. In other killing centers like Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and Chelmno, everyone brought to the camp essentially was murdered. There was no selection process. Everyone was sent to the gas chambers. The result was that there were almost no survivors from those camps. You can see the chart here. These are in some cases estimates, but they're ballparks. At Chelmno, 172,000 people were murdered, only 7 known survivors. At Treblinka, almost 1 million people murdered, and about 70 known survivors. But Auschwitz was both a massive killing center, where 1.1 million people were murdered, but also a labor camp, where prisoners were put to work in one of a dozen subcamps or dozens of subcamps and factories. And many more of those slave laborers survived the war and were able to testify about what happened at Auschwitz and who were the Nazi officers in charge. The other thing that made Mengele particularly well remembered was his tendency to watch the emptying of the deportation trains. Always on the lookout for more test subjects, he would stand on the ramp at Auschwitz even when he was not in charge of the selection. These two factors meant that he was both more visible than other doctors at Auschwitz and that he was seen by more people who would later survive. Regardless of how many people knew of him, he managed to wriggle out of the Allied roundup after the war. First, he said, and please excuse the car icon here, I just went to Google to see how far some of these distances are. But he first successfully got out of Auschwitz about 10 days before the Red Army arrived in January of 45. He transferred with several other Auschwitz doctors to the Gross-Rosen concentration camp, located, as you can see, about 170 miles northwest of Auschwitz, in what was then part of Germany. After a month in Gross-Rosen, he fled further west into Czechoslovakia, disguised as a Wehrmacht soldier rather than a member of the SS, and was eventually captured by the American army and interned in a camp near the German city of Hof. Despite the fact that Mengele's name had been included on the UN list of war criminals, in the chaos of the end of the war, the Americans released Mengele after only 6 weeks, believing him to be just another German soldier and not a particularly important figure. Significantly, Mengele had managed to avoid receiving the traditional SS blood type tattoo on the underside of his left arm. Originally conceived by the Nazis as a way to help wounded SS members who might not be able to speak when they were receiving medical care, it became one of the telltale signs used by the Allies to identify members of the SS who were not to be released if captured. But Mengele did not have the tattoo, and, dressed as a regular soldier, he was released. With the crucial discharge certificate in hand, Mengele was able to register under an alias with the local authorities when he found work as a farmhand at Rosenheim, a couple of hours' drive from his wife's home in Germany, and he didn't raise any red flags. Regardless of his success in evading the Allies in 1945, neither he nor his wife believed he was safe. For her part, she claimed her husband had died in Poland at the end of the war, a claim that was accepted by General Telford Taylor, the American chief counsel for war crimes, who noted in his files that as of October 1946, Mengele was believed dead. But the first Nuremberg trials in 1945 and the doctor's trial that followed in 1946 showed that the Americans were interested in prosecuting Nazi war criminals, and they showed that to Mengele. In 1949, seeking to end his time in hiding and stop working as a manual laborer and find some safer place to be, he relied on a network of former SS members to get out of Germany and travel down to Genoa in Italy. In July of 1949, after securing a passport from the Red Cross, which showed his name as Helmut Gregor, he sailed to Argentina. Relying on Nazi connections and his family's successful business, Mengele found work and moved into an apartment in Buenos Aires. His wife, however, refused to join him, and after a few years, they divorced. By 1956, Mengele felt safe enough to live under his real name. But 2 years later, he was forced to flee Argentina to Paraguay to avoid possible detection after being questioned by the police on an unrelated matter. The Mossad, he left Argentina just ahead of a new extradition request that had been sparked by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, who by 1959 had both found evidence of Mengele's war crimes and had found evidence that he had moved to Argentina. The Mossad's successful capture of Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires in May of 1960 pushed Mengele to move again, this time to Brazil near Sao Paulo. The Mossad by that time were on his trail and had managed to track him to Brazil. But in 1962, they dropped their search because of budgetary concerns and a prioritization of threats in the Middle East. For the next decade, Mengele, living under the alias of Wolfgang Gerhardt, avoided further detection in Brazil, but his health deteriorated. He suffered an initial stroke in 1976, and then 3 years later, on February 7th, 1979, he suffered another, one that proved fatal, as he was swimming in the Atlantic off of Bertioga, Brazil. He was buried in a grave under his alias in Brazil. 6 years later, after a coordinated effort to track Mengele down by the West German, Israeli, and American governments, things suddenly moved very quickly. On May 31st, 1985, the West German police raided the home of a known friend of Mengele and found copies of letters that included Mengele's address in Sao Paulo and confirmed Mengele's death in 1979. German authorities quickly notified the police in Sao Paulo, who were able to find the location of Mengele's grave. And within a week of the raid in Germany, Mengele's remains were exhumed under the supervision of a Brazilian forensic pathologist. Around the globe, survivors, Nazi hunters, and government officials in various countries were skeptical about the claim that Mengele had died. Many thought the story too convenient and believed it was a ruse to enable Mengele to once again get away. What was needed, everybody agreed, was scientific confirmation that the remains in the grave were actually Mengele's. The initial exhumation, however, was more spectacle than science. The exhumation took place on live television with little or no effort to control the area. The U.S. Consul General of Brazil later wrote that the Brazilian police chief and a forensic pathologist spent more time and effort showing off to the television cameras than they did looking after the evidence. They failed to record or photograph the remains, including pieces or shreds of hair and clothing in their original relationship, instead dumping everything indiscriminately into a large container after holding up various bones to the television cameras. The following day, before further analysis had been done, the Brazilian authorities agreed to bring experts in from other countries and to work collaboratively with not only German, but also American and Israeli government officers. America actually sent two teams, one organized by the US Department of Justice and the other organized by Simon Wiesenthal, or at least the Simon Wiesenthal Center, with the help of the powerful senator from New York, Alphonse D'Amato. It was D'Amato who immediately reached out to Dr. Leslie Lukash in Nassau County, a man who D'Amato had known for many years and a man who was widely respected as one of the foremost forensic pathologists in the country. Lukash quickly agreed to go, but pulled together a team to work with him. As Lukash watched the television exhumation on the evening, he was appalled at what he saw. According to one source, Lukash muttered, "They're making a goddamn carnival show out of this. They exhumed that skeleton like a bunch of Keystone Cops. The only thing they didn't do was serve drinks and hamburgers." I should back up and say that in 1985, there was no DNA analysis available. There was no definitive test to confirm Mengele's identity. The forensic pathologists were tasked with identifying the remains through high-quality comparative evidence with previous dental, X-ray, and health records known to be from Josef Mengele. The various international teams, including Lukash and 13 other experts, represented a global dream team. They began their work about a week after the initial exhumation and were done with their analysis on Thursday, June 20th, 1985. All of the team believed, at least to some extent, that the remains were Mengele's, but they needed to reach an agreement about the degree of probability that they would assign to their collective judgment. When the two American teams met to write their final report, Lukash was one of the leading contrary voices. While he agreed that the evidence they had found was consistent with the remains being those of Mengele, he feared more evidence was needed for such an important case. He said, "Remember, this isn't an ordinary case, and the public, and especially the skeptics, aren't going to accept just ordinary evidence." Despite these concerns, the final report, delivered on June 21st, 1985, concluded with this line: "It is the opinion of the undersigned that the exhumed remains are definitely not those of Wolfgang Gerhard. It is further our opinion that the skeleton is that of Josef Mengele, within a reasonable scientific certainty. A more detailed report will be issued at a later date." All 6 scientists, including Lukash, signed their names to the report. But given the massive global interest in identifying Mengele's remains and the involvement of several governments, perhaps not surprisingly, the initial American forensic report did not convince everyone. There were still unanswered questions about both the skeletal remains as well as the trove of papers and documentary evidence that had been uncovered in Brazil and in Germany. The Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations and the forensic team continued their work over the next several years. By the summer of 1988, both had issued further reports that drew on additional evidence and sustained the conclusions issued in June of 1985. I apologize for the blurriness of this image, but it shows some of the members who were working with Lukash. By the summer of 1988, both those reports had written, even Lukash's concerns had been answered, but members of the Israeli and German governments both still had doubts. It would not be until 1992, after DNA testing had been developed, that those doubts would be put to rest, and both German and Israeli governments would formally announce that they agreed that the body exhumed in Brazil in 1985 and studied by the international team of forensic scientists led by Dr. Leslie Lukash were those of Josef Mengele. In 1992, when the definitive evidence was made public, Dr. Lukash was still on the job as the chief medical examiner of Nassau County. He would continue to work until 2000, when he finally retired at the age of 80, with an incredible track record of work in local, national, and international cases. But few of his other cases could compare with the international interest and pressures that he had faced during those weeks in Brazil working on the Mengele case. Dr. Lukash passed away in 2017 after an impressive life. HMTC is proud to include him in our exhibition, to keep his accomplishments in the public eye, and to connect to our local community in Nassau County. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you for watching, and of course, if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and I'll try to answer them. Let me take a moment to remind you of some other upcoming programs. This coming Sunday, October 25th at 11 a.m., I hope you'll join us for our Drive for Survivors, a fundraiser and car parade to honor Holocaust survivors. We're gathering at the City Stadium here in Glen Cove for our drive, and I hope you will be there, perhaps even with a decorated car in honor of a survivor or several survivors. I will add, of course, that the reason for the car parade is to enable us to maintain social distancing even as we get together for this event. On Thursday, October 29th at 7:30 p.m., join us for a few days before Election Day for our virtual screening of a documentary about the voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement, which will be hosted by Claudia Swansea, a Long Islander who grew up in Alabama in the 1960s and later became president of the Roosevelt Freeport branch of the NAACP. And one more program to mention, I'll be holding my next Curator's Corner in 2 weeks on Wednesday, November 4th at a new time at noon, when I'll be talking about an image in our gallery of the Canada Warehouse in Auschwitz, a somewhat strangely named part of the camp where the possessions of millions of deportees were gathered, sorted, and prepared for sending back to Germany. Okay, you can find a full list of our programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org under the Events tab, and I hope you'll also click the Give Now button and make a donation to support our programming. Okay, let me take a look and see what questions people have posed, if any. What was it about Argentina and Brazil that made them so receptive to Nazi fugitives after the war? You know, I think there were a number of reasons, but one was there was an initial trickle of Germans to Argentina and Brazil even before the war, and they tended to support the Nazi Party and then provided the space for the Nazi SS officers and such to get out, and they provided an exit route. The governments were also just somewhat willing to turn a blind eye and feel like the World War II had been not really their war, and the events there were something that they shouldn't be involved in. So I know that's not a very satisfying answer, and it's an interesting question. I'll have to do some more research on my end to look for a more complete answer. Okay, well, thanks very much for joining once again, and I hope you have a pleasant day. Have a good day, everybody.